So let's turn to look now at the evidence from the earliest members of our species. The oldest known fossils of Homo sapiens come from a site called Omo Kibish in Ethiopia in East Africa. These fossils are almost 200,000 years old. Similar fossils from the area date to about 165,000 years old, but the fact that we have such old human fossils really seems to indicate that our species probably originated around that area and around that time period. Genetically, when we look at all modern human populations, there does seem to be a convergence of genetic lineages around 200,000 years ago. So initially, our family tree starts here in East Africa and eventually spread out, going west into Europe, some populations traveling east into Asia, still others traveling down into Australia, and eventually some populations who are up here in Siberia migrating their way into North and eventually South America. So both the genetic and the fossil evidence suggests that our species first evolved around 200,000 years ago, with our origin in East Africa. To understand how anthropologists have conceived of the evolution of culture, it's necessary for us to go back into the history of the discipline itself and talk about some of the earliest archaeological study concerning culture. So most early archaeology was conducted by people from France, from Germany, and from England. And at the time that these early archaeologists were doing their research, which was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people still had some very strong ideas about, some very ethnocentric ideas and concepts of cultural superiority that really supported the idea of European entitlement and European colonialism throughout the world. Basically, people thought that Europeans were awesome and probably the best kind of humans that there were. Now, these early archaeologists focused their attention on European archaeological sites, and they were able to find some really fantastic things. So throughout a lot of southwestern Europe, we see things like these cave paintings at Lascaux, France. Massive caves that when you walk inside, every single wall is painted with these gorgeous pictures of horses, of bison, mammoths, lions. Archaeologists also found a lot of personal ornaments, so jewelry basically, that people had carved up to 40,000 years ago. These are some really beautiful representations of small pieces of art, but really seem to identify themselves as something strongly, strongly cultural. So for these early archaeologists who were based in their research in Europe and then European themselves, finding these types of things dating to around 40,000 years ago really supported the ideas that they had about their own importance and about the importance of Europe in the prehistory of humans. So it supported that ethnocentric idea that many of them had. By comparison, the archaeology of Africa didn't seem quite as impressive, and most archaeologists weren't very interested in serious archaeological study in the African continent, especially at that time, 100, 150 years ago. So Africa was more explored by people who were employed by colonial forces, and sort of, rich Europeans who had the time and the money to travel around and collect things. These are pictures of some collections from southern Africa. These were collected in what is now Zimbabwe in 1907 to 1915. And you don't have to know a whole lot about stone tools to see that these pieces aren't particularly beautiful. A lot of what people were finding in Africa was just sort of mundane, ordinary type materials. And compared to the things, again, from Europe, the African material didn't really seem to compare. So we had on the one hand African materials that were, again, not very exciting, compared to some European materials that did seem to show some elaborated forms of culture. This led to a particular theory referred to as the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. So essentially, archaeologists thought that our species had first evolved in Africa, and they became anatomically modern there. Anatomically modern means that those earliest members of our species looked like we look today. However, they thought that members of our species didn't become behaviorally modern until much later. And being behaviorally modern means having all of those things associated with culture that we can see today. So basically they thought that there was a period of about 100,000 or 150,000 years in which our species basically wasn't very cultural or wasn't as cultural. And it wasn't until humans got to Europe around 40,000 years ago that they became the humans that we know today. Now, if this sounds like kind of a weird idea, it should. It is a weird idea because it suggests that there's something special about being European that gives one culture. And what does that say about everyone who's not European? The implication there is that non-European populations lack the same type of cultural modernity. And this is a problematic issue because we obviously know today that every human around the planet has the same capacity for culture. But this was used to explain why there's disparity in the types of cultures that we see today around the world. So this Upper Paleolithic revolution was based on European archaeological finds. And archaeologists said, all right, we have all of these things in Europe. We have evidence for personal ornaments or jewelry. We have art. We have some very sophisticated stone tools. We see that people are using more different types of food resources. So this is what it means to be human. And they then applied that framework to other places in the world. And when they couldn't find all of those things other places in the world, and specifically Africa, that again supported the idea that, all right, what was happening in Africa at the same time is not truly culturally human. So it continued to support this idea of European cultural superiority. Some anthropologists definitely had a problem with this because there are very not only ethnocentric but strongly racist tones involved in this type of thinking. And so several anthropologists tried to suggest alternative hypotheses to explain why it is that we only start seeing some very, interesting things happening in Europe around 40,000 years ago, or seemingly only 40,000 years ago in Europe. So there was the genetic brain rewiring hypothesis, which suggested that all of the human populations on Earth underwent some sort of genetic modification or had some sort of genetic light switch turned on around 45 or 50,000 years ago. And that was the impetus for this expanded, elaborated culture that we see in Europe 40,000 years ago. So it was an attempt to explain the differences in the African archaeological record and the European archaeological record without implying any sort of cultural superiority of one place or the other. Unfortunately, this theory has a few holes in it, and today most anthropologists reject this simply because we know that members of our species first originated here in East Africa, and then around 60 or 70,000 years ago first started migrating outside of the African continent. Some members of our species make it down here to Australia by 50,000 years ago. But if that switch in our genetic material, that sort of turned on the light switch in our brains, if that didn't happen until 45,000 years ago, there wouldn't have been time for that genetic modification to make its way to these Australian populations who are already living here. Because shortly after people first settled in Australia, the continent became cut off from the rest of the world because of rising sea levels. So that would have left native Australians sort of without this culturally modern genetic mutation. And obviously that's not true. So most people today reject that genetic brain rewiring hypothesis. Now, it wasn't until the year 2000 when a very influential paper was published. It's called The Revolution That Wasn't. And in this paper, two archaeologists who work in Africa argued very strongly that all of those characteristics that seem to characterize or typify what it means to be a fully modern, cultured human that you can see in Europe 40,000 years ago, each one of those traits exists at an earlier period of time in the African continent. However, they don't all show up at the same place and at the same time. So they accumulate over time. One trait developing in one place, another in another place, and it's sort of a patchwork evolution of this cultural modernity. These are each of the characteristics that European archaeologists identified as being evidence for culturally modern humans. And this red box brackets the period of time in which we see those traits showing up in Europe, 40,000 years ago. But if you follow the lines to the right, you can see that each one of these traits exists for a much longer period of time in Africa. So if we want to talk about what it means to have culture, if we want to talk about what it means to be a behaviorally modern human, we have to turn to the African continent. Because being a cultured human is not a European innovation, it's an African one. And so the seeds of our culture, the origins of our culture, really do lie within Africa. So why is it that it's been so hard to figure this out? Why have archaeologists had so much trouble figuring out that our culture really does lie in Africa, and why are they confusing it with what's going on in Europe? Well, one reason is that the African continent is huge. This map shows many nations of the world sort of inlaid into the African continent. So up here, we see the United States. All of the United States can fit within just one fragment of the African continent. Okay? Here's an outline of the country of France. All of those archaeological finds that I discussed before, the cave paintings, the beautiful ornaments, they're from a relatively small region of France. There can be, upwards of 100 archaeological sites in this one tiny little region. Now, if we turn back to Africa, there are probably only 100 archaeological sites within this entire southern region. Okay, so it's a matter of research bias. Archaeologists haven't been working in Africa with as much intensity and for as long a period of time as they have been working in Europe. And so we've just excavated far fewer sites in Africa than we have in Europe. That means that our understanding of the record is skewed. We have more information from Europe just because people have been studying it for longer. Once we start exploring Africa with the same intensity that people have studied Europe, we will very likely see that all of those characteristics that are identified in the European cultural assemblage really do have very, very strong predecessors in the African continent. So, again, being a culturally modern human is not about where we get to, it's about where we started from. And that place is certainly Africa. And so if we want to understand why European populations 40,000 years ago were doing something different than African populations before them, we have to understand the particular context in which those European populations were living. When those first migrants into Europe arrived 40,000 years ago, they encountered a very, very different situation than they had ever faced before. They were a species that had been adapted to the East African climate, to living in a very open space where resources were probably relatively bountiful, and not a lot of competition between groups. So people were pretty spread out. But when humans first got to Europe, they encountered another hominin species. They encountered the Neanderthals, or cavemen, as some people call them. The Neanderthals are not humans, but they are a human relative. They're sort of our distant cousin, and they evolved separately from us in Europe. So when humans arrived in Europe, they suddenly had to contend with another group of very human-like things, and they essentially had to compete with them. And probably the way that they competed with them was by having a greater social cohesion amongst themselves. And that social cohesion was something that they demonstrated through the use of cave paintings and personal ornaments. So it's sort of like wearing a necklace to show what group you're a part of, right? That affiliation between individuals forms very strong social bonds, and that probably helped our species survive, whereas Neanderthals ultimately went extinct. So what does all of this have to do with the evolution of culture and unilineal evolutionism, which was our topic from the very beginning of this lecture? Well, if we're going to consider the origins of culture and how culture has changed around the world over time, what we really need to think about is that every culture is responsive to the stresses that are particular to it. So every single human group has adapted according to the requirements of their environment. For people like the Kalahari San, who live here in southern Africa, they're able to maintain a relatively liberated lifestyle where they hunt wild animals and collect wild plants because they're spread out on the landscape. They live in small groups, and so far there hasn't been a real need for them to significantly alter those particular lifeways. Whereas we, living in a place like New York City, we are very, very complex, not because complexity is the best way to be, but because complexity is the only way we've been able to survive. It's our particular adaptation that has enabled the survival of the most people. So every human culture around the world does what they need to do to survive, to make sure that people make it to the next generation. And when times get hard, people have to adapt. So the fact that we have this very, very big, complex society is more of a reflection of the fact that times have been hard and we've needed to try to keep up just to keep ourselves alive. And it's certainly not that we are some sort of culmination of progress over these thousands or millions of years. So we resist this idea of unilineal evolutionism by remembering that every culture adapts and responds to its particular circumstances. If you're interested in exploring this topic a little bit more, I'd recommend this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is by Jared Diamond, who is actually an ornithologist. He studies birds. But he was working in Papua New Guinea in Southeast Asia, and someone asked him, one of his field assistants asked him one day, why is it that you, meaning you Americans and Europeans, you white people, why is it that you all have so much stuff, so much material wealth, whereas we do not? And that's, it's an interesting question to ask. Why is it that some human groups have so much more wealth than others? What accounts for this disparity between cultures around the world? And so Jared Diamond investigates this question and really looks at the certain circumstances that have forced humans to either innovate or adapt in certain ways to meet all of their particular needs. And that's what explains the disparity in cultures that we see today. So in that sense, having some complex, elaborated societal system is not a measure of being more evolved or being smarter or being superior. It's certainly not a marker of any sort of cultural genius. It's just about doing what you need to do to survive from one year to the next.